So welcome to our April Tap Talk, everybody. I really appreciate you being here this evening. This is a partnership between the 500 Women Scientists Corvallis pod and Block 15. Before the pandemic, we would all be in Block 15 enjoying beers and food together, but I appreciate you all being here on Zoom in the meantime until we're all able to gather safely again. A little bit about the 500 Women Scientists. This is a national nonprofit. We're a local pod of that nonprofit. And the mission of 500 Women Scientists is to serve society by making science open, inclusive, and accessible, by fighting racism, patriarchy, and oppressive societal norms. And so as part of this idea of making science open, inclusive, and accessible, we help plan these Tap Talks every month where we learn about science and science from a local woman in our community here. If you'd like to learn more about our pod, we do have a website. You can also follow us on Facebook or Twitter, which you may have already done because you found us here this evening. And just some quick Zoom norms. So please keep yourself muted. If you're not muted, we will mute you so that we can focus on our speaker tonight and not have any interruptions there. We will have a question and answer at the end for like the last 15 minutes. Feel free to put your Q&A in the chat at any time, and then I'll facilitate that at the end. So if you have a question and you're worried it's going to leave your mind, just type it in the chat and send it, and I'll come back to those questions at the end of our talk. So with that, I will introduce tonight's speaker. So tonight we have Dr. Susan Salafsky. She's an ecologist and a science advisor with the Mid-Valley STEM CTE Hub and a K-12 substitute teacher in Corvallis. And the bio that I got was a fascination with animals, nature, and puzzles from an early age translated into graduate research on the impacts of climate and land management on habitat quality. Using changes in forest food webs during a period of extreme drought, which we'll hear about tonight, followed by record high participation, she identified the impacts of water retention and structural complexity on forest productivity. She used this information to explore ways to modify timber harvest to improve the ability of terrestrial and aquatic species to withstand extreme conditions. Most recently, in response to the pandemic, Dr. Salafsky is collaborating on the development of the Healthy Planet, Healthy People campaign, has been working in the outdoor science program and community science projects to enhance participation in outdoor activities, environmental science, and biodiversity conservation. So with that, I will let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Really appreciate it. And thank you again, everyone, for showing up today. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here and to finally share these ideas that have been wandering around my brain in what feels like an eon. So why don't we get right to it? Oops, I just got a little far. But before we begin today, I would like to introduce you to someone. This is my grandmother as a teenager in Switzerland. She's taking in the view after a hike. Throughout her life, she wondered about the natural world, and I'm fortunate to have inherited her curiosity and her discernment. I'm also grateful because thanks to her estate, I was able to complete my PhD research after losing my federal funding. Her support in life and afterwards allowed me to pursue my dreams. So this presentation is in honor of Agnes Preisberg Zeller, the coolest woman. So today, these concepts here will be used throughout this presentation. So before we begin, let's make sure that we're all on the same page. Observation is information. Observation is information obtained using the senses, whereas inference is a conclusion or opinion based on facts and reasoning. So this presentation is about how I used interpretations of observations to develop explanations for patterns and processes in nature. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about the power of observation. I will be discussing how we perceive our surroundings, what are observations, what is the power of observations, what is a hypothesis using 4 examples from my research, and ultimately why it matters. First up is the relationship between observation and perception. Observations are based on perceptions of, sorry, I didn't want to get there yet. Observations are based on the perception of environmental stimuli through our senses. However, due to differences in our DNA and our lived-in experiences, we all have unique ways of perceiving the world. Yet, we use the same labels for observations so we can communicate. For example, think about how the colorblind see color. So although we all see color differently, we agree that orange is orange. Or at least after we learned of their existence. See, before the 1500s, the word orange did not exist in the English language. It was not until orange trees were brought to Europe from Asia. Prior to that, the color orange was yellow-red. So sometimes our perceptions needs translating. Did you know that we actually see the world upside down and I think in reverse? This is because the lenses project upside down 2D images on the backs of our eyes, and that the brain then transforms into right side up 3D images. How brilliant is that? So did you also know that we have a physical blind spot? So to see it, I'm going to guide you through it, all right? So I'm going to do the same thing, and I want everyone here, if you can, try to do this. So to see it, you want to close your right eye and position your face about, oh, sorry, wait. It would help if I show you what you're looking at. Ta-da, right? All right, let's take 2. So to see our physical blind spot, what I want you to do is I want you to close your right eye, position your face about 1 foot from the screen, and look at the X, sorry, you can't see that, X with your left eye. So the dot will be in the peripheral vision, which is this outer part of your eye, the outside edge of your eye. So then you're going to slowly move your face closer to the screen while looking at the X. At the right distance away from me, that's about right here, the dot will suddenly disappear. So you really have to look with the eye that's open, which is your left eye, at the X. Are you guys getting it? Anyone? Yeah? Cool. So why is that? Well, it turns out there are no receptors on the surface of the optic nerve that we use to see. It is literally a blind spot, but our brains fill in that gap by what is around it. In this case, a white background. So the power of observation is understanding what is in our blind spot by paying attention to the relationships and context of observations. So what is the power of observation? Good tea. No, that's not the power of observation. The power of observation can be used to understand our world. For example, in part from his observations during his time spent on the Galapagos Islands, Darwin developed the theory of evolution and identified the connection between all things. Robert Cushman Murphy said it best when he said, "Nature is a chain, a million knotted web or fishnet of life. Nothing exists of or for itself, but only in relation to other organisms, as Darwin seemed to know more thoroughly than anyone else." Such a good quote, in my opinion. The power of observation can also be used to predict the future when it's based on historical records. Sea level is rising. Sea level rise is accelerating. So it's crucial to determine the impacts of human-induced global warming on the risk of flooding. But it's not like a bathtub, because sea level is not rising everywhere at the same rate due to the currents and the movements of the Earth's crust. So currently, the mid-Atlantic of the US East Coast has the fastest rising sea levels in the country. But without detailed information, it is unclear how quickly each place will be inundated by the forecasted 3 to 6 foot rise in sea level. So researchers are racing to digitize thousands of pages of tidal records from around the world to improve computer models that forecast future sea level rise. Because the accuracy of these models are critical for helping communities in floodplains prepare. So if you'd like to help, check out this link to the Zooniverse Community Science Project. And there you can get some of these pages and transcribe them yourselves and digitize them. And I should say, we forgot to mention, we'll make sure that all the links and such that are in this presentation will be available either in the chat at the end. Actually, we didn't prepare for that, so I lied about that. But they'll be available when it's posted online on our YouTube site. So the power of observation can also reveal a phenomenon or truth hiding in plain sight. So in 1868, lichens were discovered to be a partnership between two organisms. One species makes the nutrients and the other provides water and shelter. But in the last decade, researchers found another partner in the relationship hiding in plain view. They discovered it by studying lichens that are common in local forests. However, it's still not clear what that third species contributes to the relationship. So the researchers are using their observations to develop hypotheses. So what is a hypothesis? It is an explanation for observations or facts that can be used as a starting point for further investigations. Isn't that just the cutest picture? It looks like a burrowing owl to me, but don't quote me on that. So tonight, I'll be sharing 4 hypotheses I developed from my experiences, research, knowledge, and imagination. I'm going to discuss how I use natural history clues, or how I use clues from natural history, my food web research, and established ecological principles, in addition to my imagination, to develop explanations for my observations of the natural world and the questions they provoked. So my first hypothesis is about Tyrannosaurus rex. The observations that led to this hypothesis include Tyrannosaurus are theropods, which is a group of bipedal dinosaurs with hollow bones. In addition, recently, evidence was unearthed that indicates that some theropods had feathers. So scientists use observations of modern birds to reimagine what T-Rex looked like. This is what they came up with based on their understanding. The adults are thought to be partially feathered, as you can see on the crown, the back, and then down at the very end of the tail, this fluffy poof. The adults are thought to be partially feathered, while the turkey-sized hatchlings were likely covered in feathers. They also have a large, heavy tail that shifts their center of gravity backwards. Additional observations include that in birds, the parts like their feet and beak offer clues about what they eat. For example, consider the difference in the beaks of parrots and hummingbirds. So, in terms of raptors, the distinguishing characteristics of all raptors includes keen eyesight, sharp talons, and a hooked beak. So in this picture, this is a picture of a goshawk, which is the bird that I studied in its food web. And you can see the talons are the sharp nail-like claws on the feet, and then the sharp hooked bill is pulling at the prey item, which looks to be maybe a northern flicker or something. So in addition to that, like avian raptors, T-Rex had large eyes, about the size of oranges, and their position suggested good depth perception for hunting. Although modern raptors apparently evolved from theropods, and they capture and kill prey with their feet, supposedly, T-Rex couldn't run and had to keep one foot on the ground at all times. Given my observations of goshawks and other raptors, I'm suspicious, especially since scientists recently observed the evolution of a completely new species in the wild and in real time. Species of birds, I should say, not dinosaurs. Well, but birds are dinosaurs, right? So, Merriam-Webster defines, Merriam-Webster defines vestigial as remaining in a form that's small or imperfectly developed and not able to function. So supposedly T-Rex and other theropods had vestigial arms. So, right? Well, I'm not gonna go into that yet. So, okay. Yet, although it took less than 20 years for inbred finches on a small Galapagos island to become a new species, theropods had useless arms for 179 million years? An entire group of dinosaurs? Seriously? Instead, I think T-Rex had wings. But I don't think they used them to fly. I think they used them to hunt. Why? Because for 25 years, I studied northern goshawks, which is an apex predator in forest food webs. Goshawks are formidable hunters with powerful wings and a long tail that they use to zigzag through the trees in pursuit of prey. To capture prey in mid-flight though, goshawks, because now again, they're darting through the forest and through the trees, so to be able to grab a prey in front of them on the ground, they have to throw their wings back and swing their legs forward so they can use their talons to grab their quarry. And in that moment, they look like the bird that's on my logo. Thanks, Mom, for developing it. So, like goshawks, I think T-Rex use their wings so they can pounce on their prey. It makes a lot more sense to me than explanations involving vestigial arms for 179 million years and improbable mechanics of movement, like having to have one foot on the ground at all time. What in nature? I mean, are you kidding me? So, That is hypothesis number one. T-Rex had wings. My second hypothesis, I must admit, I pulled an all-nighter last night and I didn't finish my presentation until maybe an hour before this presentation. So if there's any kind of off, you know what that is. But again, it's done and I'm so glad to be here and to finally get these ideas out to you all. So anyways, my second observation is based on observations regarding food. So I'm going to use three examples: birds, dogs, and humans. But I'm going to start with birds. So the first observation is that all modern birds evolved from small theropod dinosaurs. My understanding of how this happened is that extreme events like a meteor or prolonged drought first caused the plants on Earth to die. Then the plant eaters, followed by the meat eaters. Eventually, only the small bird-like dinosaurs that could eat seeds survived and adapted to the changing environmental conditions. The second observation is that more recently, changes in the beak shape and size of finches were attributed to the impacts of extreme drought and greater food scarcity. As a result, Peter and Rosemary Grant identified the 2002 through 2003 drought as a small-scale version of dramatic evolutionary changes documented in the fossil record. So next I'm going to move on to dogs. And the first observation for dogs is the result of a study conducted on a fox fur farm. As part of an experiment, only foxes that exhibited tame behavior were bred. But in less than 10 years, the offspring of those foxes exhibited many dog-like traits, including tail wagging, curly tails, spots, and floppy puppy-like ears. The second observation for dogs is that when humans lived in the same spot for a long time, they create waste. And wolves that don't run away quickly from approaching humans, consequently, had greater access to valuable food resources. So based on these fox experiments, these tamer wolves were more likely to produce offspring with dog-like traits. I didn't say that right, but the point is that, again, dogs that had low flight distance to get them, in other words, you could approach them before they're gonna go run away, would be able to get more food resources in than dogs that would run away more quickly as humans approached. And again, so these are kind of tamer dogs, and the tamer dogs, when they reproduce, likely the same effects as what they saw with the foxes happened with the wolves. Or jackal. Lair Brisbane actually thinks it's a jackal. Anyway, okay, so, so the third observation involves rock art from southern Utah. And you can see in this picture, there's clearly, this is a dog with a human or a humanoid figure. And we know it's a dog because it's got, the tail is up and curved over the back and the prick ears, and it's standing and it's facing the human. When you see rock art of wolves, they typically, their tails go straight back. They'll often have teeth, and they'll usually be looking at a group of antelope or sheep or something. So what happened though is thousands of years ago, those dogs, maybe the same dogs that initially got tamed at our dumps or our waste areas, migrated into North America with humans. They were the ancestor of Carolina dogs, like my dog here, Maisie. And they were used to hunt food. Although in this picture, Maisie is hunting flies. So although there are wild populations of these dogs throughout the United States, no one knew of their existence until I. Laird Brisbane discovered them in 1976. Carolina dogs are now recognized as a breed by the American Kennel Club. The third example regarding my hypothesis on food is that it's based on the evolution of humans. Again, my understanding is that our ancestors supposedly left the trees in search of food, or maybe the trees used us to disperse their seeds. Climate shifts resulted in migrations in search of water and resources, so we eventually found our way to the coast. There, we figured out how to capture nutrient-rich seafood. The plentiful resources meant that our brains could stop focusing on the search for food, and the resulting leisure time allowed early humans to be creative. They used it to develop art. The evidence is that when archaeologists excavated early human settlements, the first layers with art pigments came after earlier layers with the remnants or remains of seafood meals. So, what does this all mean? Well, without sufficient food, there is no reproduction or survival. So if diet turned dinosaurs into birds, wolves into dogs, and apes into humans, food is likely the mechanism of evolution. But before we move on to the next hypothesis, I want to give you some food for thought. What does the average diet of most Americans tell us about the future of humans? My third hypothesis is based on my food web research. And the hypothesis is in regards to habitat. This is a map of my study area in Arizona. You can see it from space. The part that most of that I focused on my study area, if you look, so this is the Kaibab Plateau, and just to the south is the Grand Canyon. And so my study area, the main part that I did my study area in is the National Forest, Kaibab National Forest. But directly below Kaibab National Forest and above the Grand Canyon is the north rim of the Grand Canyon Park. Now the forest obviously harvests trees, which the big white dots, those are actually natural meadows. But if you look to the south, Grand Canyon Park does not. And so you can actually see a straight line cutting across the plateau that marks the boundary between the National Forest, where they do not really harvest trees, and the park, where they do. And the forest, where they do. And especially those cuts and the harvests in the lower part of the National Forest were this really heavily thin, it's like even thin, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. So This is the map that I created then of my study area based on the distribution of these 4 cover types. So in this map, the green area is at the lower elevations of the study area, and it represents ponderosa pine forest. So that's this beautiful forest here that has these big, large red trees, not a lot of growth in the understory. It was said that historically you could drive a wagon through the uncut woods, ponderosa pine. The purple, which occurs at the higher elevations of the study area, is mixed conifer forest. And as you can see from this top picture on the right, it is very dense and there's lots of shrubs and stuff in the understory. Now, the difference between the light and the dark colors. So dark green and dark purple represent the forest type that has only been selectively harvested. In other words, individual trees have been removed. The lighter colors, light green and light purple, represent what's called a seed tree harvest, where they remove most of the standing biomass and leave only a few trees to reseed the area. So when I was talking about the forest to the south, it's this ponderosa pine forest where they've decimated the natural clumps that ponderosa pine grow in and would just leave individual trees evenly spread out. So, due to the fortunes of time, the first 2 years of my research occurred in years with average precipitation. Oh, I didn't want to go there yet. Followed by so let me say that again. Due to the fortunes of time, the first 2 years of my research occurred in years with average precipitation. However, they were followed by a 3-year drought that culminated in the driest year in 100 years. Then the next year was the wettest year in 80 years. So as you can imagine, the impacts of these extreme events reverberated throughout the food web. Interestingly, I found evidence of the 2001 and 2003 drought in places all over the world through responses to my ResearchGate question. So ResearchGate, for those of you who don't know, is basically Facebook for scientists. You can post your publications, you can ask questions, post jobs. It's a way just to definitely to communicate with others. And it's super fascinating, such a great platform in so many ways. Anyways, the question I asked was, what was the global extent of drought conditions during 2001 through 2003? And how did it affect the biota? I got people that responded from all over the world. From Albania, from all over the United States. This drought was everywhere. Not everywhere at the same time. I'm not saying blanketed, but rather in specific places. And it was a very severe drought in all of these places. It's the drought that the grants noticed the changes in, then I read it earlier. And what's so crazy is this drought can even be detected in the size of the ozone hole. So you can just ignore the bottom graph. And basically this top graph here is the size of the ozone hole. So in this top graph, 2002 is actually the lowest value and the smallest hole since 1983. And so when I first came upon this, I was really confused. Why would such a severe drought make the hole get smaller? But it turns out, again, my understanding is that it has to be cold enough for the reaction to occur that creates the hole. And so obviously during an extreme drought, things were really hot, especially because you don't have a lot of plants breathing and growing and such. So it's crazy, but there it is in the drought. There it is in the ozone hole as well. It really indicates how global these phenomena are. Oops, sorry, jumping ahead. So in response, wait, did I go too far? So with my research, I discovered that the productivity of forest types changes over time with the fluctuations in these temperature and precipitation. Again, it didn't matter how I analyzed my data, that climate signature kept popping out, obviously, if it's 100, historic conditions. Anyways, the effect of this drought is easiest to see in the cone crops produced by ponderosa pine trees. So once again, here's the 4 cover types that I was talking about. And this is where I'm talking about the productivity changed among these cover types. So prior to the drought, so here's this graph that I was just talking about. And on the y-axis, it's the number of ponderosa pine cones produced per ponderosa pine tree. And so as you can see, when you look at the high density pine habitat cover type, the picture of it, and the high density mixed conifer, in both those pictures, you can see there's a ponderosa pine. So ponderosa pine grows in both places, but obviously in ponderosa pine forest, it's a monocrop basically. And in mixed conifer, it's mixed with many other species. So the bottom axis, of course, is the years. And my study started in 1999. So as I said before, 1999 and 2000 were wet to normal years. And you can see that green, again, is ponderosa pine forest, produced more cones than ponderosa pine trees, pardon me, in mixed conifer forest. But in 2001, the drought started. And by the 3rd year of the drought and beyond, now mixed conifer produced as many cones as trees in ponderosa pine forest, or even up to twice as many cones in ponderosa pine forest. And what's so interesting is that the densities of these prey species as well fluctuated with the changes. And so these changes in their food resources could be seen in their prey populations as well. So as a result, goshawks with access to greater diversity of forest types produce the most offspring over time because they could exploit the availability of food resources. And so what this figure is here, well, first of all, this is an adult goshawk, beautiful red eye. And then again, so this plot is of 102 goshawk territories that were a part of my study. And in each one of those sites, at some point between 1991 and 2004, goshawks attempted to breed on that site that's shown. One of these polygons, they're called polygons, the little circle-like things. And by breeding, I mean they laid eggs. And so once again, what you can see in this plot is that not only are the territories where there was a breeding attempt evenly distributed throughout the entire study area, but it's also evenly distributed among the forest cover types, particularly the difference between ponderosa pine and mixed conifer, right? They're evenly distributed in both those forest cover types. So, but next, what I'm going to do, these next figures are going to show you how the distribution of breeding goshawks varied in time in response to those dramatic climatic conditions. So again, the first 2 years were wet to normal years. And as you can see, quite a few birds attempted to breed or had laid eggs. And again, they're pretty much evenly distributed throughout the study area and among the cover types. However, in the first 2 years of the drought, and especially in the first 2 years of drought, all of the birds that were breeding in the southern half of the study area disappeared. They did not attempt to breed. And only really one of them or so here tried to in 2002. Keep in mind, again, what I said about the way that the forest looks compared to the national park. That southern part is where they did that crazy thin, where they just left individual trees from a clump of trees, and those trees were evenly spaced, right? They isolated them in ways that they're not normally are. So then now here are the two extreme years. 2003 was that driest year in 100 years. And so only 10 birds out of 102, or 10 territories, because it takes 2 birds per territory, attempted to lay eggs. What you should notice though too, is that in this case, most of them are on the edge of the boundary. And if you think back, and I forgot to like kind of mention that, but if you think back to when I showed you the satellite picture of my study area, is that because it's the Grand Canyon, the plateau, it immediately drops off and it goes right away into basically into sage desert. And well, it goes into pinyon juniper before it goes into the sage desert, but you can get there pretty quickly, right, as the crow flies or as the goshawk flies. So it turns out the reason why all those sites are the ones where they attempted to breed, all of these ones on the edge of the study area, is because they were actually going far, far away because there was no prey on the entire plateau basically. And they had to go down to the sage desert and catch black-tailed jackrabbits. And black-tailed jackrabbits are 5 times heavier than any other prey item that they eat. So if they can get a black-tailed jackrabbit, they get that leisure time that I was talking about with humans when we started eating seafood. And they don't have to leave as often. Each time, especially if they have to go so far away to go get that food, they're risking their young getting predated or dying from exposure to the elements. So they do it because the risk was worth it at that point. The following year, even though it looks like the territories, there's not quite as many territories and they're not evenly distributed throughout the study area. Remember, this is the wettest year in 80 years now. It's actually just an artifact of what happens and how we study goshawks and how we find them. So basically the way that we find goshawks in the beginning of the year is we go in and we go back to the last nest they use, because goshawks tend to use the same nest over and over. But after 3 years, and as you can see, many of them in the south that didn't nest, we weren't sure where to find them. And what's really cool is actually a lot of them, and several of them ended up moving to the sites where I had set up my prey transects, because I just thought it was good habitat and I was trying to quantify the habitat, but it turns out, I guess they thought so too. So my research on forest food webs during extreme drought suggests that habitat quality is a function of water retention and structural diversity. This is likely because the forests that are more diverse provide climate refugia by enabling different responses to environmental conditions. And since Peter and Rosemary Grant found that evolution is most likely to occur when extreme events alter community composition, this suggests that habitat quality is a determinant of evolution. I forgot to make that forward. You can tell it's a little rough, my apologies. So my fourth and final hypothesis is based on observations of gravity waves. So gravity waves are ripples that stretch and squeeze anything, are ripples in space that stretch and squeeze anything in their path. They were discovered in 2015 when the impact from a collision of 2 black holes that occurred 1.3 billion years ago was detected on Earth. Yet most illustrations, like the one you see here, still depict space as a flat, featureless surface. I think it's misleading based on what I first observed in an episode of NOVA. Since the material is copyrighted, I cannot share it with you today. But it's the Chasing Pluto episode. And the part that I'm talking about starts at 29 minutes and 10 seconds. And again, we will give you all of this information later. And if you want, you can, do the screen. But fortunately, so what happened is I was watching NOVA, and I just happened to be watching NOVA, and I saw this phenomena, and I was like, what the heck is that? And so I searched NASA, and I searched, and I fortunately found this lower quality image from NASA that depicts the same phenomena. Can you see it? So the small dot moving slightly off to the center in the image is the Kuiper Belt object 2004 DW. But what I first noticed in the Chasing Pluto video are what looks like ripples moving right to left across the image. Do you see them? Then I noticed that when the ripples pass over the brightest stars, the light stretches. I also noticed that there are horizontal dark lines also extending from the brightest stars. They flash on and off. Do you see them? Especially the one on the bottom. What you can't see in this video, because again, the low resolution, and it's not nearly as good as the one in NOVA, is that there's a large dark space behind the ripples that looks like the image in this video. I can even probably play it. No, I can't. But again, well, you'll have the links so you can play it yourself. So if this is the case and those are really gravity waves, how could they potentially impact environmental conditions? When gravity waves stretch the Earth, I'm not prepared. Oh, and I'm not going to be able to do this. Where am I on time? Okay, we're all right. Okay. Woo. So when gravity waves stretch the Earth, can you see me? The poles get closer to the sun. So if this is the Earth and the tail and the dog's head are the poles, basically, right? When gravity waves stretch the Earth, that's going to put the North Pole and or the South Pole, depending on the time of year, closer to the sun, which means that they're going to be subject to warmer temperatures. And when gravity waves squeeze the Earth, the distance between the equator and the sun is reduced. Again, subjugating the poles now to colder temperatures, like during the Ice Age. And again, though, see, that was something where there was no escape for the air, really. But the pressure from gravity waves squeezing the Earth might be kind of like a tube of toothpaste. And so if this was now the Earth and the gravity wave squeezes it, what did you hear? And what does that indicate that's coming out of this hole, right? Air and then the noise. So maybe the gravity waves could increase volcanic eruptions, or with it stretching it, maybe the magnitude of earthquakes. Because if the Earth is stretching, those plates are going to move. So, oh, wait, I'm sorry, I'm distracted. So here's what I think space looks like in the presence of gravity waves. It demonstrates how the distance and time since the event, which is a raindrop, determines the magnitude and frequency for the impacts of the gravity waves, right? You can even just see in the still picture, some of them are colliding, some of them are bigger, some of them are bouncing off of each other. It all depends. So the other observations that can reveal potentially the impacts of gravity waves include the 11-year solar cycle. The solar cycle is a cycle in the sun's magnetic field that affects the activity on the surface of the sun. Giant eruptions on the sun can cause northern lights to impact radio communications and affect the I said that all wrong. Giant interruptions on the sun can cause the northern lights, impact radio communications, and affect the electricity grids on Earth. Another example is the well-known Lynx hair cycle, which is characterized by dramatic highs and lows in rabbit populations, followed by fluctuations in lynx populations. But the highs and lows of the lynx cycle do not always occur at the same time among regions. For example, in the early 1990s, lynx numbers peaked 2 years later in the Northwest region than in the Southwest region. But scientists do not have an explanation for what is the force that creates this cycle. There's some debate, there's now thought that the rabbits, the offspring have suppressed chemicals or something, which keeps them, the stress hormones. They have higher stress hormones or something that prevents them from producing as many young. But they still don't explain what is the every 10 years and why this happens of every, well, actually 8 to 11 years. So although scientists don't have an explanation, I think it suggests that gravity waves are the force of evolution, that combined with everything else. Currently, we are starting a new solar cycle. Oh, I didn't want to go there yet. Currently, we are starting a new solar cycle, and the pattern suggests that this one will result in cooler temperatures. However, due to the impacts of our emissions and wastes, humans are rapidly increasing global temperatures. And with it, the magnitude and frequency of extreme events. So what can you do to mitigate the impacts from gravity waves and reduce human consumption of resources? All the activities listed here will enhance your awareness of the connections among all living things and ultimately create a healthier environment. However, of the utmost urgency is understanding how quickly and how much environmental conditions are changing in response to global warming. Due to the high probability of more frequent and severe extreme events, again, Peter and Rosemary Grant et al. Encourage investigators to be prepared for evolutionary change in response to rare events during long-term field studies. As Louis Pasteur said, in the field of observation, the chance only favors the prepared mind. But I would amend that to say, chance only favors the well-studied environment. So if you want to contribute more than those other activities that I listed, please consider participating in eco-surveys to monitor change. It is a survey I designed to create a systematic and permanent record of observations that anyone can use to identify changes in environmental conditions. So to contribute information, what you need to do is to choose an outdoor spot for your survey and then open the eco-survey form through the link that's up here or the QR code. And I'll definitely put that in the chat tonight. So then after you've done that, you spend 15 minutes observing your surroundings. Immediately afterwards, so you remember all the details, you want to document your observations on the weather conditions and the organisms you detected. Then submit the form, and eventually the data will be included in a public database. The greater numbers of completed surveys at different times and locations, and by a greater diversity of participants, will enhance our ability to detect change. And the world is constantly changing, in part due to forces beyond our control. So if we want to create a better future, we need to understand the factors that influence it. By observing and documenting environmental conditions, we can determine the impacts of events and the context of our blind spots. Thus, through our shared observations, we have the power to reduce uncertainty and consequently, the ability to increase the probabilities of outcomes that we desire. So I hope you will join me in trying to spend more time outdoors observing your surroundings to ultimately create healthier communities. So thank you, everyone, especially to my family and friends and everyone else that supported my research. And with that, there's a minute for questions, unless we want to go a little longer.
Yeah, we can go a little longer. If folks have something to get to at 8 o'clock tonight, no worries. But I know it's really hard in Zoom to end your presentation, so I'll just give you a round of applause for a great, a great talk. And we have time for questions if folks want to stick around and put some questions in the chat while folks are thinking about their questions and typing them up. I guess I'll just ask a quick question to get us started. So just a generic question. What is your favorite thing about science and being a scientist?
I get to use my imagination and curiosity. As I said, I've always been fascinated by nature and the natural world, and I love the puzzles. So that's what it all combines. Yeah.
Also, your audio is doing that weird robot thing again. So maybe mute yourself and unmute, and let's see if that fixes it.
Is that during the presentation too?
No, just now, which is kind of strange. It's still doing it. Let's.
Better?
Unfortunately, no.
Should I leave and come back?
Or you could try changing your microphone, maybe?
Right. Yeah.
This is giving people plenty of time to type questions in the chat.
Yes, please. Better?
Yes. Sound lovely now. Perfect.
Thank you. I don't want to be a robot. Thank you.
Any questions for Dr. Salafsky?
I just told you the craziest ideas and nobody has a question? Did you buy it? Was I really that convincing?
I guess I'll ask another follow-up for your research that you did with the goshawks. And you talked about this a little bit, but what was the most like one surprising or unexpected thing that came out of that research? I know there was a drought that you didn't plan for, but was there something where you came away from that and you were like, wow, that was not something I expected through the scientific process, or not something that I expected to observe?
Well, I don't know. That's a really hard question, actually, because I mean, the whole drought thing was surprising. Again, because I didn't even know it at the time, right? I didn't figure out that it was the driest year in 100 years and the wettest year in 80 years. Because, I should mention, the time is a little bit off because I used a biological year, not a calendar year. So my year went from April to March, because that's when the goshawks start breeding on the Kaibab Plateau. Yeah, I just knew at the height of drought, I was like, there's nothing, it's boring. Like, I have to go out every morning and I'm not seeing anything, right? And then, I didn't mention though, that was a nice surprise. So I had put out those transects, 5 years prior to that last year of the study when we got the deluge. And as I said, like, I just found this certain types of habitat, and I just tried to find transects that would, places that would fit the requirements, like that you can see the line at all times and those other things to do this estimation that I used. But that was it. And then otherwise, I just try to make the sites look as alike to each other as possible and as different from the other ones as possible, of course, because that's the key of monitoring or anything. That's why I was saying, go to the same place at the same time, because those places are, that's the easiest way to detect change, right? If you're always going back to the same spot, that's the point about those title records and all of that kind of stuff. So what was so surprising, again, is that I picked right. Because then the goshawks ended up in that next year, that last year, moving their breeding sites literally right on my transect lines, basically.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Well, thanks everyone for showing up, and my family too. I'm so psyched.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming this evening. Oh, we do have a question. We have a question. Nice, thank you, Paul.
I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah, go for it if you've read it.
Want to read it?
Yeah, folks who can't open the chat or haven't seen the chat, says, how significant is the deformation of the Earth due to the gravity waves?
So that's the thing. So the first time that I heard about this was actually on, I guess it was the Tonight Show by then. Or Late Show with Colbert. And he had Alan Green, I think is his name, on it. And so he was showing, because this was right after LIGO, and that's how they detected the gravity waves. That's the mechanism. There was not even. It was like, he said that the Earth, so with this gravity, but remember, it was really far away and it was a really long time ago. He said it moved like less than a micron or something like the Earth, right? But that's my point. It's like, yes, that's not going to do much, and that's not going to heat the poles up that much. But what if those black holes collided right next to Earth? Or what if our sun goes supernova? Those gravity waves are going to wipe us out, like, right? So that's the point. And that would make Earth go crazy up and down, right? And as well as burn us up, but yeah. So really small, but I wonder. Yeah. Mike, sorry, do you want to read it again or should I? I should.
Yeah, you can read it. I'm not seeing a question. Another question. So maybe even just to you.
Yeah, so I can say it. So it's Mike Mascott's question. And it's, I have a question about T-Rex wings. It makes sense, but why don't we see that in the fossil? So partly is because they only recently started finding evidence of feathers in the fossils. Again, part of it is when you look at the old videos or whatever, when they're excavating the dinosaurs, and they're just all about the bones. They don't care about anything around it, right? They're just, you know, I mean, when they get really close to the bones, they're using really fine and whatever, but before that, they've got jackhammers and they've got whatever, right? And so, of course, they're not going to find that kind of thing. It's also, that's what they say about hair. Like, even though they've not really, I don't think they've, maybe, again, more recently now with global, you know, warming and the melt and Uzi or Ozzy or whatever, the people showing up and all this stuff that has been buried for a long time is now coming to the surface. They hadn't really found hair on people because it doesn't last, right? That's the stuff that goes away the quickest. But because apes and whatever and mammals all have hair, and because we have hair, and we're, you know, on either side of us, there's hair, they just make the assumption that they too had hair. But again, we don't know. And so I think partly that's why when they did that visualization of T-Rex and they're still not giving him wings, and they just, the little feathers in the little places, because maybe that was the only place it was left on the dinosaurs that they found. And all the other feathers had already, you know, disintegrated or whatever.
Great, we have another question. Says, are the types of feathers in dinosaurs similar or quite different from the types of feathers in modern day birds?
So my understanding again is that recently they've been finding fur-like feathers. So that, like the kiwi is an example of those fur-like feathers. And that's kind of, if you saw, that's kind of what they put on that T-Rex. But I'm gonna butcher this. Pteryx or whatever, however you say the first bird, or many even. In fact, the High Desert Museum here in Oregon had a phenomenal display where they had all of the different bird dinosaurs. And in those cases, you can see the flight feathers, which are those long feathers that come off the arms, and was what I think T-Rex had. They leave imprints in the stone. And so they probably had them too, but again, that's the part that disintegrates. And so we haven't really found a feathered dinosaur like that, as far as I know. But it makes sense, right? I mean, 175 million years? Like, and I didn't do all my things, but I have all these things where I actually imitate them. I mean, think about it. So everyone says that they don't catch it with their feet, they catch it with their mouth. Now imagine you have little arms and you're supposed to like get in my mouth. Like, how in the heck are you gonna even be able to bend down and grab that little prey item or that whatever it was? And not only that, but now you can't even take your foot off the ground. You have to have one foot on the ground at all times. It's like, so crazy. So actually, I originally thought it was kangaroos. I thought they hopped like kangaroos. That was the first thing that triggered me. So I was, again, watching some nature show, as I like to do, clearly. And there was kangaroos, and I saw them hop, and they look like T-Rexes. I mean, they're the same shape, right? They got that long, narrow little head, and they do have kind of little arms, but their arms aren't totally useless. And then they have the long tail like that, and they hopped. And so I actually thought, before I had considered feathers, and before I thought they hopped like a kangaroo.
I'm just imagining a T-Rex hopping in my head right now, and it's very enjoyable.
Well, right, but then the jaws hop. I mean, that's the crazy part, right? Like, yeah. Oh my God! Like, can you imagine? Like the wings. I mean, that would be really freaky. Because they were, what did we say, 15 feet high at the hip or something? Mm-hmm. The adults.
Yeah. Great. Well, it looks like we don't have any additional questions, and we're about 10 after 8. So thank you again for the wonderful presentation. It was excellent. I enjoyed thinking about my power of observations. And thank you everyone for attending this evening. I do want to remind folks that our next TAP Talk is going to be May 4th, which happens to be Star Wars Day. So maybe, if you come wear your Star Wars gear. So May 4th will be our next TAP Talk, same time on that Tuesday evening, 7 p.m. on Zoom. We're going to have Yvonne Rarica. She's a PhD student in the Department of Environmental and Molecular Toxicology, and she'll be talking about forever chemicals, what zebrafish can tell us about PFAS, and I hope I said that acronym correctly. And Yvonne is also the person who does all our social media for the 500 Women Scientists Corvallis pod. So yeah, so I'm really happy to hear her talk about her science, but when you see her Instagram posts and Facebook posts and links for these events, that's Yvonne. So thanks for doing that too. All right. So thank you again, Dr. Salafsky. Oh my goodness, butchering your last name. Thank you again, Dr. Salafsky, for the great talk. Thank you everyone for coming. I hope you have a great evening, and we'll get this video posted to YouTube, and we can get the links underneath the video for you if you want to go check that out later. So have a nice evening. Thank you.